Thank you all for coming. I'm really grateful to be here to speak with you. I wanted to talk about building confidence in AI and sleep. I'm not going to talk about a lot about the performance of our AI or anything like this, but I think we have a very important discussion that we need to start, and it's great to be here with all of you, scientists, clinicians, sleep technicians, engineers, and there are a lot of things about AI that I feel that we are not addressing enough. And it has to do with communicating the performance, the limitations, and the proper use of AI in sleep. So I'm just going to talk about this a little bit and tell you a little bit what we're thinking, starting with the team. So I lead the team at Nox Medical, which is a team of engineers and psychologists. We are focused on data development, so both AI and other kind of data models. What we do also is the clinical validation of our AI models, and we of course have to follow regulations in both Europe and the United States to show that our AI is safe and effective for use in patients. And it's tough, and this is where I need the researchers to pitch in, because both with methodologies and with benchmarks. Because how can you say that, for example, your sleep staging model performs like a human unless you have actually data on how humans perform? And we need really honest comparisons there. We also participate in data collection in clinical trials and write some publications and speak at conferences. So let's just start. I mean, I'm sure in this group there are people who are developing AI, there's also people who might be curious about it, or maybe they don't care. So it's like everything. So let's just start. What is AI? It's used for many things. And I always like these tweets because they kind of highlight that how AI is used. If you're fundraising or if you have a PowerPoint, it's probably AI. If you're programming, it may be machine learning, it may be statistics, and when you're debugging, it's just printf and try to find where the bug is. But AI is used for a lot of different things. We see also a lot of terms being used and flashy terms, but it's the essential what it is it's a software that's making a decision. And it can use very simple methods to do this or very complicated methods to do it. And some methods are more suitable for different cases. So it's a very broad term. It is an automation of a cognitive task, and it's learning from data. And I think this is really the key, it's learning from data. And then I'm sure there's a statistician in the room saying yeah, we've been doing that for a long time. So what are you doing differently? It's just different marketing, I guess. But at the core, it's always statistics. There are other common terms, machine learning, deep learning, data science, all these things, and they're kind of used differently. But AI is not magic. And it's not intelligent. It's very good to keep that in mind. So, like Svenny talked about, the information has to be in the data. So if you don't have the information in the data, it doesn't matter how much AI you throw at it, you will not get information from the data that doesn't exist. And I really like this, press release from Google. They wanted to develop contact lenses to measure glucose levels. So you can imagine very important for diabetes, huge market. But they found out that the information is not in the data. So even Google, with all their resources, doesn't matter how much AI you throw at it, if it's not in the data, you won't get it out. And for people who are not experts in AI or not engineers or maybe not experts in physiology or something, how can you tell that the AI claims are plausible? And I have these kind of 3 questions that I like to run through. Can a human do it? If a human can do it, then it's plausible that AI can do it. If a human cannot do it, it doesn't mean that AI cannot do it, but it's going to be difficult for AI to do it. Is there a plausible mechanism? Think about if you want to predict the stock prices using weather data. Is there a plausible mechanism that you could do that? Yeah, you could think, yeah, there are some scenarios like seasonalities or something like this, but it's not a very strong evidence. But if there's a plausible mechanism, it's plausible that the information is in the data and you could pull it out. But you also have to think about, what are the limitations? For example, predicting the stock prices with weather data. you can probably see that there are limitations which are jumping out. And also for sleep diagnostics and in medicine, it's very good to think about, okay, you have this AI, you're using it for this, but what are the limitations? When will it break down? And I always like to start with very extreme examples. So think about someone who wants to predict sleep stages using plethysmography signal. And I always start, so if the patient doesn't have a heartbeat, would you do it? No, probably not. But then also probably sleep is not their biggest problem. But if they have a pacemaker, would it work? No, probably not. And then you can kind of work your way back and try to figure out, like, what would be the limitations? So just going over like machine learning basics. So in conventional programming, what we do is that we write programs, and these are just a set of rules, and we apply these rules to data, and they give us results. And this is very powerful. And when you have rules that are clear and humans understand them, humans also understand like what can go wrong, when I have to be careful. And we do a lot of this. Machine learning, on the other hand, is that when you have data and you have the answers, but you don't know the rules. And this is what we do, for example, in sleep studies. We have sleep studies, we have them manually scored, so this is the data, the manual scoring is the answers. And then we can have computer models learn a representation, transferring these input signals into a scoring. And it's a mapping of patterns to a scoring. And then once we have a model that we are satisfied with, we can freeze it, we can stop learning, or you can continue to learn, you can choose that. But typically we freeze it, we release it, and then the users bring their new data that they recorded, and they use the model, so the rules that the AI models created, to generate new answers. And hopefully that works. We've been doing AI in Knox for a long time. Actually, 2016 we released the first AI, what I would call like a modern deep learning neural network to score sleep stages. We have interns at Nox Medical, and we typically like give them tasks that we think are going to fail, but could be interesting. And in 2015, we had an intern, he was obsessed with AI. And because I also did my, graduated around 2000, in a period where everybody knew that AI doesn't work. It is good for nothing. And so when this intern was like, yeah, I want to do AI, I was like, yeah, you can do it, but you have to do conventional signal processing because AI will never work. But at this time, there was like the beginning of this AI revolution that we're seeing now. And he managed to create these models and kind of change the path of how the company worked. So an intern that was just finishing his bachelor's degree kind of changed the path how we work. We released it, and we were told, you're not allowed to talk about that there's AI in the product, because no one will trust it. No one wants it. There's been a lot of changes since then, and now everyone is like, don't you have AI? What are you doing? So I want to talk a little bit about something that we did, which is the Knox body sleep. That's a very nice thing that you can do with AI. You can do things that humans have a hard time doing. And we thought, you know, there's information about sleep in the breathing signals. And can we then train a model that takes breathing signals as an input and predicts sleep? And this is what we did. And with the model, we could detect wake, non-REM sleep, and REM sleep. Of course, we wanted to detect non-REM 1, 2, and 3. But if you think, you know, is it plausible? If you think about, like, how do you transition from non-REM 1 to non-REM 2? You see spindles. Would you see spindles in breathing? Probably not. It's probably a very hard mechanism to do. And we found out it's, you know, you can do something, but it's not very reliable. But there's another thing which I think is also very important, and this is an active topic to discuss. And for researchers, I think this is a very good topic to think about, is when you do something like this, that you're predicting sleep from a breathing signal, humans don't have rules to look at the data and verify that the outcome is correct. Like there's no ASA manual for scoring sleep from breathing. So we have to be creative and find a way to communicate to the user, like, is a model, you know, is it certain? Is it uncertain? Like, where should you trust it? Where should you not trust it? And these AI models, I mean, they are not intelligent. And if they were human, they would be very arrogant. I mean, they would just say, it's like this. Because they don't know anything else. They just say, it's like this, and there's no discussion. So what we did, and this was a great idea that we saw in a paper from Emmanuel Mignot, was this last panel. It's what they call the hypnodensity plot. And what it's outputting is, how likely is each class to be occurring at any time. And you see, like, during the non-REM periods, you have these big green areas, but then you also see, like, small red dips or small yellow dips. And this is where the model is, like, it could be this, it could be that. And maybe for humans, they could maybe go and look at the data. I know, like, sleep text, they can estimate also sleep from the breathing signals and check, does it make sense? Does it look like the patient is sleeping? So we had this concept, and we have this as part of the medical device. But what I wanted to do for this conference was to see how I can break the idea. So we have a poster on this tomorrow, but I'm just going to go through it because I think it's like, hopefully it gets people talking. So the idea was this. We have this breathing-based model, but what happens if we change the model a little bit, and instead of inputting the breathing signals and the activity, we take the signals from the pulse oximeter, so the pulse, SpO2, and the pulse waveform, and the activity, and train a model to predict sleep like this. So the first thing that we realized is, so this is some performance metrics of the sensitivity of sleep for the body sleep and the PPG, so the oximeter-based model. And the first thing we realized is that it's much harder to detect sleep from the pulse oximeter than it is from the breathing. And my goal was really to start out with two models which were performing identically. So, but what we ended up having to do was to make a much bigger model for the oximeter data than the breathing data to get it. And we didn't make a model that was actually equivalent. So that was the first thing we learned. And we see that the models they are performing, so this is a sensitivity, so are they picking up the wake, REM, and non-REM? And then also specificity and the overall accuracy. You can see this in the poster if you want, and we can go through this in more detail there. But the point I wanted to make here is, here you see the sleep profiles, and you see this is like a patient, like a normal sleep apnea patient at a sleep clinic, and you see, okay, we get these sleep profiles, and I also show the pulse and movement signals, just to give you a little bit of an idea what is going on. Yeah, okay, so we can do it. I mean, it works, and we see there's a lot of people doing something like this. But then we did something else, and we have a great relationship with researchers in Portugal, Dr. Sousa, and they are collecting data on patients with atrial fibrillation. And this was really my question. So what happens if you take this pulse model and you apply it to the patients with atrial fibrillation? Will it work? So this is what we did. And we saw that the performance of the breathing-based model is not affected so much, and it's maybe not surprising, but the performance of the oximeter-based model is affected. And especially, like, it doesn't detect REM sleep so easily anymore. And what it does, and what everyone would do, is that if you're uncertain, you just classify everything as the most likely class. So it just puts everything into non-REM. And so there was just kind of getting this concept out a little bit, like being a little bit critical about what are the limitations of the models. And we need to be very careful in communicating this and as researchers, coming up with methodologies and strategies, how to test the performance of these AI models and how to communicate it and how to do it in the best way. Here we also see the sleep profiles, and I included a pulse signal because and this is a person that had atrial fibrillation through the whole night, and the pulse is going everywhere, and you see that the pulse oximeter-based sleep profile is of course everywhere. We also had one study of a patient with a pacemaker, and you can imagine how that goes. I wanted to talk a little bit about validation of AI. And I think we are really lacking there, and we need to do more work there and to kind of build up a mutual understanding and more research and better methodologies and better data. So when we're doing validations of AI, of course we have to collect validation data. And the validation data needs to be representative of the data that the model will be used on. And this is really nuanced. So the data has to have the correct characteristics. So for example, and I get this question all the time, it's like, you have your AI models, I have all these studies from someone else in an ETF, can you run the models on them? And my answer is always no, I cannot do it. Of course, I can do it, but the results would probably not be great. And the reason for this is that in different recorders, you have different characteristics. And this is well known, for example, in image processing, that photos from different cameras, it's very challenging to make models to analyze photos from different cameras. And it's the same for sleep. So when you're validating your model, you should have data which is representative of the data that you use, will be used in the future. And the patient population, of course, it has to be representative of the patients that they will be used for. For example, the Knox body sleep algorithm, I would not use it on a narcolepsy patient population. It's not intended for that. It was not, we don't have a lot of those patients in the validation set. It has to reflect normal use, and all the sources of bias have to be considered. And when I talk about bias here, I talk about it in a very broad sense. It's, of course, everyone starts to think about patient populations, different races, ethnicities, sex, socioeconomic status, all these things which we typically think about when we think about bias, but we also have to think about the things that maybe are not so common. And we have a story of this, that we trained the model using data from the United States, and we validated it on data from Europe, and it didn't work. And the reason for this is that we feed the data into the models, like the raw data, and then in the US they have the power at 60 hertz, and in Europe we have the power at 50 hertz. So the model learned that there's no information at 60 hertz, but it was using information at 50 hertz. So when we used it in the European data, the model was totally biased against the European data. So we have to be like really thinking about bias in a broad sense. And also thinking about information leaking. And this is also a very nuanced topic. So I made a small schematic, and I know it's maybe a little bit hard to see it, but think about this. So if you are training your AI model, so every sensible person, they would collect a lot of data, maybe from two sites, and they have different scorers. So I have the two sites in two colors, and the scorers there have all their colors. And then you random sample from your data pool. And you split the data into like a training validation set that you use when you're training the data. And then you have a part of the data which is hidden away that you don't look at. It's a hidden test set. And when you have a model you think it's working, then you look at the hidden data and you see, okay, the model also works for new data. And then you say, it's fine, it's great. You know, I've shown that it works on new data. But there's a problem, because there is information leaking from the training data to your hidden data set, because you may have scorers which are scoring studies in both the data sets, and they may be scoring it in specific ways. So if you have data scored by different people, the model might not work anymore. You might also have something at the sites which is specific to those sites, and your model might be overly optimized for those sites. So actually what we do when we validate our models, it's like in this European US story I told you, is that we have a third data set, or a fourth data set actually, which we call the real world validation set. So this is typically data which is coming from different sources, was scored by different people than any of the data in the training and the hidden validation sets. So it's really new data. So, and this is exactly what we had in the US case, is that we had US data and then validated it on European data and found out there was this thing that we hadn't considered. So that's one thing which we are pushed to do, and this is, you know, this is what the FDA tells us to do. And I think it's a very good practice to really think about having a real-world data set and really limiting the information which could be leaking between the data sets. And also the metrics that you use. And we see a lot of metrics being used, and people always show high numbers. I guess you don't get published if you don't have very high numbers. But they're sometimes not very informative, and even, you know, everyone knows this, like you can lie with statistics, and this also applies to AI. And I'm not saying that some metrics are bad and some are good. The metrics, some metrics are good for certain occasions, and while other metrics are good for other occasions. And we have to just be cognizant about this. So think about this, for example, you have an algorithm which is scoring arousals, and you test the arousal index. And you have a very high correlation. So there are two things there. First of all, is the arousal index the most important part in determining how your arousal scoring is performing? Or is it more important to determine that the arousals are actually scored in the correct places so that you can score, for example, hypopneas? So maybe then the correlation is not the best metric, or the arousal index is not the right index. And also the correlation. So why do you get a high correlation? You might have studies, and it's very typical, that you have most studies don't have many arousals, and then you have a few that have very high arousals, and you do the correlation, and you get a very high correlation because you have these few studies which are kind of pulling everything up. And even if the correlation is high, it doesn't mean that the correlation is like 1-to-1. I mean, you just have the same, like they're both increasing at the same time. Endbland-Altman, sensitivity, specificity, and accuracy, all these different kind of metrics, they have their place, but sometimes they are good ones and sometimes they are bad ones. And I made a small example to go through this. So this is made up data. It looks similar to what I showed you before, but it's not the same numbers. But I just want to show you, like, if you think about sensitivity, specificity, and accuracy for an unbalanced data set. So in this case, we don't have a lot of wake epochs. And let's look at like what it means, these performance numbers. So in this example, we had 10% of the data as wake, and we have this 8.5% of the epochs are correctly classified as wake, and 1.5% are incorrectly classified as sleep. And we calculate these metrics. So what do we get? We have it here. The sensitivity is 85%, specificity is 95%, and the accuracy is 94%. Great. So what happens if we have a model that scores no wake? So what happens if you do nothing? Then you have a specificity which is 100%, because specificity takes into account the true negatives. And your accuracy is also 90%, overall accuracy. So you have a model that's doing nothing, and that's your baseline. You start with 90% accuracy. So reporting something which is like 90% accuracy, it doesn't tell you much. And it's very good when you're thinking about it, when you're reading these validations, just to ask these questions. So what happens if I do nothing? What would I get? And if you have unbalanced data, you typically can get very high performance numbers with doing nothing. So I'm just showing here like how you calculate these metrics. So the sensitivity is the true positives and the false negatives, and the specificity is the true negatives and false positives. And if you have a lot of negatives and you say everything is negative, you get a lot of true negatives. And the accuracy is also including the true negatives, so in unbalanced data sets, it can get very high. So that's something to think about. I don't have all the solutions. I just wanted to get people thinking. We have these posters, so both the sleep staging and also an arousal poster tomorrow, and we're also at the booth, so you can always come and see us there. Thank you.